It's an African story with global resonance. For decades, African students have left their homes on the continent in pursuit of higher education abroad. The dreams they carry are often not theirs alone.
Those three letters, MIT, they mean a lot to people. People expect things from you.
I see no reason why I shouldn't, live up to the expectation of my people back home.
And when all is said and done, how many of them live up to expectations? And how many with a dream deferred?
What happens when African students go abroad as international students? What is the reality of that story of return, right? There's this simple narrative or expectation that we get given, which is go abroad, get the best education, come back, But the reality is a lot more complicated.
We'll hear from a filmmaker who's walked in these shoes previously and is telling the all too familiar story in his new documentary. And AI chatbots tend to know quite a lot, but there's one bit of information Google's Gemini may not be able to provide you at this time. We'll tell you which one. This is the A55 podcast. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Hello and welcome to another episode of the A55 podcast. It's great to reconnect with you all again this week. I've got some good news. We got our first 5-star rating on Spotify. Yay! A big thank you to you. Yes, you who gave us that rating. It means a lot to us because you're helping make this show visible to others. And to all of you listening who haven't rated or reviewed our show just yet, we're still counting on you. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, you can find the review and rating section at the bottom of the page that has all the episodes. And shout out to all of you who also shared the link of our premiere episode with your friends directly and on social media. Speaking of which, you can connect with us on X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram. Our handles are at A55. That's the letter A, then 55POD. Now, let's turn it over to Gertrude Davison Tete, who has our proverb of the week from Kenya.
It is better to be poor when one is young than becoming poor at an old age.
Thanks, Gertrude. When one of my mentors sent me a text message a couple of months ago asking if I'd heard about the screening of a documentary about African students, I told him I hadn't, but I'll check it out. As if to convince me further, he texted back that the documentary was directed by a Ghanaian filmmaker. Of course, I immediately dropped everything and opened the link he sent. What I didn't know at the time was how similar my story was to that of the filmmaker. I knew I shared something in common with the students in the documentary, given that they'd come from different parts of Africa to study in the United States, just as I'd come from Ghana a few years ago. I would later discover that the filmmaker Arthur Musah had walked the same path nearly 2 decades prior. In the 2021-22 academic year, nearly 950,000 international students studied at various colleges and universities in the United States, and that's according to the Open Doors report by the Institute of International Education. Of that number, 42,518 were from sub-Saharan Africa, with over 14,000 of those students coming from Nigeria alone. Ghana came in a distant second with nearly 5,000 students. For that academic year alone, African students made up 4.5% of all foreign students enrolled in U.S. colleges and universities. But this is not new. Africans have been traveling abroad for higher education for decades. Take, for instance, Ghana's first president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. He studied at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania in the United States in the mid-1930s, and he later enrolled in a PhD program at the London School of Economics in the 1940s. Even though the years have changed, the challenges young Africans pursuing studies abroad face haven't. As I speak, I'm sure there are potentially thousands of high school graduates or college graduates from across Africa applying to further their education in the US, UK, Europe, or Asia later this year. But how prepared are they for the challenges ahead? What do they even know about these challenges? And will the pressure to excel and the desire to see their own dreams materialize and meet the expectations of families and friends help or break them along the way? Arthur Musah directed and produced the award-winning documentary Brief Tender Light. It followed 4 students from West, East, and Southern Africa through their educational career at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT, in the United States. Arthur, thank you very much for joining us on the A55 podcast. I guess let me start by saying congratulations, in order, for your documentary Brief Tender Light. You had it recently screened in the US. I saw it in New York, and I know you had some screening in DC as well.
Yeah.
And you've had your, can I say, US broadcast premiere on PBS?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. So tell us a bit about the documentary and also how you feel having a US broadcast premiere, as we're saying, making it available to thousands or millions of Americans to see on PBS.
Yes, thank you, Nee. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast, and thank you for coming to check out the film. It's great that it reached you and it connected with you. So the film Brief Tender Light is a documentary feature in which I follow 4 African students through the American college experience at my alma mater, MIT. MIT, many people know, is sort of an elite institution in the US and around the globe, a leading engineering school, but a great place to study in general. And everyone in the film, including myself, 10 years before the participants, going through it, felt like we had to make this journey count for our homes and our communities and our families. And so, the central tension in the film is about how do we live up to that expectation that either we ourselves embraced or our community placed on us, and how do we make this opportunity count for our homes as well.
Okay, and the fact that it's been broadcast to millions, I dare say, of Americans watching the PBS, and even probably more.
Yeah, so it's a great honor to be on PBS. It's actually really wonderful for the film to be on the POV program. It's one of their nonfiction series. We just had our broadcast premiere on MLK Day, January 15th. So, just to be associated with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy of fighting for equality and justice is a great honor also. But I made this film to kind of celebrate the lives of African student immigrants or international students around the world through this film that's set in the US. And so I feel like it's a big win for the film to actually get this kind of distribution, this beautiful, large platform where a lot of people in the US can see the film or have seen the film and will continue to see the film because it's streaming on the PBS website for free within the US through April 14th. And then I also have some partners that I'm working with to try and find distribution beyond the United States. So we're excited to be able to hopefully get that figured out so that people around the globe can see this film.
Now, I know you said it took over a decade to put this together, and for us to be seeing it now in 2024. And the students are from 4 different countries in Africa, so that people get to know that it's not just students from one particular country. I'm wondering why you think this story is important now and is gaining the attention that it has garnered so far.
Yes, so I have always felt it's an important story because I lived that story myself. So when I was 19 years old in the year 2000, I came to the US to study as a student for college. And the flight that brought me to the US was, I don't know, like a third or half full of other Ghanaian students, many of whom I knew. Some were my classmates, actually. So I came with 2 of my classmates from Presbyterian Boys Secondary School. We were all headed to MIT, and then there were other classmates that were headed to other colleges all over the United States. But I had this awareness of, that this is a story that had been happening for years and years and decades, where African students go abroad to study, to seek the best education possible in order to, and also to kind of explore the world. I think part of that awareness was because my dad, decades before I did that journey, also took a similar journey. His opportunity and took him to the Soviet Union. That's how he and my mom met. And, we moved to Ghana, which is where I grew up. And then, years later, I took that journey. So I felt like that was an African story that had not been told, but that had been happening. And given that I was in the center of it and my family had been in the center of it, and I had this passion for storytelling, I felt like there was probably nobody better to do it. I mean, maybe there are other people that could have made the film, but I had sort of the opportunity and the desire to really tell that story, to really explore what happens when African students go abroad as international students. What is the reality of that story of return, right? There's this simple narrative or expectation that we get given, which is go abroad, get the best education, come back, But the reality is a lot more complicated, right? What does it mean to grow up in a culture that's different from the one you were raised in? How do you change because of the pressures that the foreign society applies on you, because of the time away from family, right? How do you navigate your own personal desires for your life, which become clearer as you mature from childhood into adulthood through the college experience? And how do you kind of negotiate that with expectations that you yourself imposed or your community imposed on you for kind of giving back and plugging back into society? So I felt like there was a complex story that had been going on for a long time, and that story had major implications or repercussions for our globalized world, right? For Africa, for our individual countries, but also for the US or Europe or Asia, wherever African international students go. And so this film was motivated or inspired by a lot of questions that I had and that I'd been talking with, my colleagues, my friends who had gone through that experience together. And, through the lives of the 4 participants who were so generous to kind of come on this journey and be true collaborators, we got to kind of explore those questions and make a film out of it.
And I'm happy you did, because like you said, others could have done it, but so far I don't think I've seen that. And that is partly my story too, because I came from Ghana just like you to study. I'm just curious because, like you said, MIT is mostly known for engineering. How on earth did you end up not focusing on engineering and then doing this? Because when we think of MIT, we don't think of it for the liberal arts studies. We think of it for engineering.
Well, it might surprise people to know that MIT actually has very robust arts school. It's called the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. So a lot of incredible teachers, lots of great resources. I had the great fortune of studying with some really amazing writers when I was there. People like Helen Elaine Lee, Anita Desai, Juno Diaz, the late Bill Corbett. But I will say, just take a step back from MIT. I guess I've always been a storyteller. That's something that I'll always love to do. Even my secondary school years in Persec were defined by the drama club, right? When I think about high school, for me, it wasn't the science and math, because I was a science student. It was really the plays that we got to put on, the plays that we got to write, or the short stories that I would write. Because I think, you could probably relate growing up in Ghana, if you can do the science, the math, like you're funneled towards being a doctor, an engineer, maybe a lawyer. But to be an artist, nobody really encourages that, And actually, when I got to MIT had this pre-orientation program, which is kind of just like, come here early, 3 or 5 days early before orientation starts, sign up for a program. Either there's build an underwater submarine kind of thing, or do the arts. So I actually signed up for the arts program. And of all the arts disciplines, I had kind of done a little bit of music, I'd done a little bit of theater, I'd done a little bit of writing. So the only thing I hadn't done was film. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to check it out. And so actually the very first thing I did at MIT was to make a little documentary. I think I don't remember what it was about, but it was in the group of 5 students, and we got a camera and got to shoot something on campus. And I didn't think of this until like many years later when I was working on the film. I realized, oh my gosh, actually the very first thing I did at the engineering school was to create a film. Anyway, long story short, I've always been interested in storytelling. I've always felt like there was a power within storytelling, in all kinds of storytelling media, whether it's film and books, in poetry, in theater. There was an opportunity to kind of hold up a mirror to society and to help society kind of analyze itself and make conscious, critical, and thoughtful decisions about where we are going, right? And I always felt like in quote unquote developing countries like Ghana and so on and so forth, we focus so much on the immediate needs, which is kind of like we need engineers, we need doctors, we need X, Y, and Z, to the detriment of the arts. But actually, arts are an important way in which we can move our societies forward. We can build better, stronger, healthier, just more equitable, more just societies. And so, studying at MIT, becoming an engineer while writing, because MIT had a humanities, arts and social sciences requirement. You had to take 8 classes before you graduated. Those requirements allowed me to kind of keep the storytelling interests alive, to meet incredible writing mentors, and then eventually to kind of reconnect with that after I'd graduated, to reconnect with that love of storytelling and to pursue it by going back to school for some years at the University of Southern California in the School of Cinematic Arts. And then when I stepped out of that, to start to create this project that became Brief Tender Light.
So as a filmmaker or as a storyteller with roots from Ghana or in Ghana, what influences the type of stories that you choose to tell? Does your African background have a role to play in it, or do you just choose to tell stories that are of certain topics that are of interest to you, or what?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I do think my background informs the stories I tell a lot. If I look back at the works that I've created, I'm always interested in exploring and sort of representing and celebrating African lives on screen, because I grew up, loving movies. But, when I was growing up in Ghana, we had one television station. A lot of the material, a lot of the films were foreign, and they never really represented Ghanaian or African people or African realities. Ghana had some classic films that occasionally you'd get to encounter, but they weren't readily available. But I've always wanted to tell stories from my writing to the films that I create that explore and celebrate Africans, African realities, African ambitions, the complexity of African people. And so I think, just because I draw on my background, I draw on things that I've lived and experienced of people that I've seen. And so that's really what feeds my storytelling for the most part.
There was a line from Brief Tender Light that has stuck with me since how many weeks ago that I saw it till now, where in your narration you spoke about how we often tend to start out as saviors because, we see so many things happening around us every day. We get frustrated as people, and we tend to start out as saviors hoping to, make some big change. But then somewhere along the line, we realized we are really just citizens. So when you started making this particular film, what did you hope you were going to achieve? Or did you think you were going to move some needles somewhere, make some big impact? Or did you just do it because you just wanted to tell this particular story? Essentially, I'm asking, did you start out as a savior or did you start as a citizen?
I think I was definitely in my citizen era at that point when I started. I think by that point, so I was working as an engineer before I went to film school, and I felt like there was a big creative force within me that wasn't really being utilized, right? Yes, engineering required some creativity, and I was doing well in that career, but there was a part of me that really wasn't utilized. So I picked up a camcorder, started playing around with it, and I realized I wanted to make films, and so I explored that. And then I got excited about the idea of doing something that I am personally really passionate about, right? That I can just kind of like pour countless, endless hours into for work, but then also having that work have an impact on the world that I care about. So I was excited that if I became a storyteller in film, a filmmaker, that I'd be doing something that I love, but I was also putting myself in a position where I was telling stories that I wanted to exist in the world that didn't, that explored African realities and represented African people and African stories in complex modern ways. So I think at that point I had gotten into this mode of thinking, which is that actually the way to create lasting impact is not to try and solve the biggest problem in the world, but actually to find what it is you're good at. What change do you care about in the world, and what are the privileges that you have within your particular life, which could be like talents or maybe like your family situation or whatever, your access to a certain kind of education. You look at those and then apply those in a very focused, very specific way. So that rather than trying to solve everything, just do the thing that you care about, because you got to make a living. So the ideal scenario in my mind is do the thing that you care about, but also meeting your like the demands of an adult's life. So I was definitely making a film because I thought it was a film that was very important, and there were a lot of people living this experience, and we hadn't really examined it, so it didn't really exist. And to some extent, I knew that. I mean, I was hoping that maybe like a Netflix or whatever would come fund it very quickly, which didn't happen for many years. But I was determined to make it. So in some ways, I was the citizen. I was determined to like create this film and make sure it existed because I cared about that. And I felt like my community would care that this film existed. And then hopefully eventually other people would come on board and see its value as well. But that was my way of sort of giving back to my community, to Ghana, to Africa, to the African diaspora, to, I guess, humanity in general. That was my little contribution.
And I asked also because, and I'm, like I said earlier, I'm happy you did this because it's the experience of so many of us who have already walked this path. And many more keep coming behind us, not knowing exactly what it entails. And the film highlights one of them, issues of, as someone mentioned during the screening, mental health, because it gets to the part where you're beginning to slightly experience that split between what you thought would be and what actually is happening, and missing your family and not being able to go home, and the pressure of work that you have to deal with at school, issues of identities. These are sometimes issues that we don't tend to discuss in our African communities. When you were doing this story, was that something you were particularly looking out for, or did they just happen? Because, that's really what happens when you are thousands of miles away from home and trying to achieve a dream.
So when I started the project, like before I ever shot anything, I actually wrote out a proposal to put down into words what I thought the film would be, what kinds of themes it was exploring. Obviously, at the before I shot, it was like 8 years of filming, and then some of my story in the film makes it a 10-year time frame. But before I started filming, obviously I didn't know what was going to happen specifically. But having lived through that experience, having missed my family in different ways, actually, over the 10 years it took to film, and then the 20 years that I've been in the US now, I felt like what I was going through and what some of my other friends had gone through and we had talked about, those were not necessarily unique to us, right? Those were things that were in some ways common. And so I felt like, yes, there's probably going to be, there was going to be the question of, am I getting estranged from home? How much is too much, right? Obviously, I have to adapt to a certain society. I knew people would be challenged by the academic course load, right? Because MIT is notoriously rigorous, but also you're adjusting to a new way of doing school, right? There's that aspect of it. Maybe you've never made a presentation before. Now you have to, I mean, these days, computers are more ubiquitous with cell phones and all that stuff. But 24 years ago, when I was going through that experience, I learned to type on a computer in Ghana because I heard all the assignments in Ghana, everything was on paper and, pen or pencil. And I was trying to get ready for this scary experience, because I didn't want to be behind. But there's still a lot of stuff that you have to get used to, including society, from everything from food, from people making you repeat yourself because they can't understand your accent, right?
Yeah.
And before you learn how to adapt enough, not to lose yourself completely, but to make yourself understandable and so you can move through the society a bit more efficiently. So I knew there were things that they were going to experience based on what I had experienced and what my friends had experienced. And so obviously those things informed the film and what I was looking for. But the specifics, this wasn't the kind of film where we set up something or okay, we want this to happen. And so, that might be in reality TV shows, sometimes producers pull the strings a little bit more. With this documentary, it was really just kind of working together with the four participants, Billy, Philip, Fidelis, and Sante, to, make it very clear, this is what we're chasing in the film. These are the themes we're exploring. So if you're going through something that's interesting, you have a video diary, you can capture it. You feel like sharing it with the world, you can capture it, you can document it, which they did an incredible job of. And those video diaries were a core part of the film. Or sometimes they would call me and say, hey, this is happening, there's this event, I think it might be interesting, and then I show up. So it was really about discovering the specific story that they were going to go through. But obviously there's a universality of themes that I think stay consistent no matter what decade you're looking at. And I think that's why the film resonated with your experience, because if I understand correctly, you went through the MFA program pretty recently. They graduated in 2015. But in terms of how the film is edited, my editors and I realized that it really was important to put hard timestamps because we were chasing the universal and the kind of eternal in some ways.
And if I remember correctly from the beginning, you said you wanted to make a story about these students, also for a story for the modern world. And I'm just wondering, is there a thing like a contemporary African story? And if there is, in your opinion, what would that kind of story be like, considering an ever-changing world?
I think a contemporary African story would be one that allows for great diversity in storytelling. I also think a contemporary African story is one that's authored by Africans, because historically, films about Africa have been created by not Africans, just because of where the power has been with, funding and technology and all that stuff. And so I think, when I think about my film as a modern African story, it's not so much as that it's set today or it's only showing you positive things about Africa, because I don't really believe in a one-sided or one note, either all bad, all good. I think life is complicated, and so it's about really distilling that, but it's also about who gets to tell that story and whose perspective is being represented. And so I think for me, a modern or contemporary African story is one about diversity of voices, and one that includes a lot of African voices and is authored by Africans.
Okay.
And in some ways that aligns with kind of what I was saying about in the film about saviorship versus being a citizen. I think I really believe in collective efforts for progress, for societal progress, and for change that is long lasting. I don't trust anybody that says like, I alone can solve the problem. I am your savior, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of problems with that. And even if they can give you a solution to the problem, it comes with all kinds of trade-offs and often may not be long lasting or stable. And I really believe in kind of multiple people contributing to building lasting positive change or progressive change for society. And similarly with storytelling, I think, there can be one film, it can be Brief Tender Light, that represents accurately all of contemporary Africa. Brief Tender Light can contribute one story to the collective narrative. And I think that's where the work needs to happen.
So now Brief Tender Light is out to the world. What are you working on next? Do you have a story?
I do. I have some stories. Yes, I have stories that I'm developing and that I'm working. That I would love to find funding partners, production partners, and hopefully stories that can get made in a shorter time span than it took to make Brief Tender Light. Less than 13 years would be great, and funded from the get-go would also be great.
Yeah.
So. I'm writing some stuff. I'm interested in fiction features. I'm interested in adapting some works. I've reached out to friends who write short stories and novels, and to see if there's anything we can collaborate on to put on the screen. I'm also interested in episodic work and series. I think TV series, are really popular these days, and they're very exciting because they allow you a bigger platform to really kind of build characters, really go deep into a character, and because you have more time to
not just
spend
2
with
hours.
them. Not just the 2 hours and 90 minutes that it might take for a feature. So anyway, I'm kind of interested in a lot of different forms of cinema. I actually believe that there's a right form for different stories, right? Some stories are best told in a feature documentary format, some in a fiction feature format, some in a TV series, some might be best as a novel. And so, there are ideas that I'm working on, that I'm writing, and that I'm developing. So looking for partners.
Okay. Well, we are here to help in any way we can. So just let us know.
Thank you, Nate.
Thank you, Arthur. I highly recommend watching Brief Tender Light if you get the chance. And for those of you in the US, you can still catch it on PBS until April 14, and we'll let you know when it becomes available internationally for those of you outside the US who also want to see it. Now, generative AI is supposed to be good at providing you with information much faster than you can search online yourself. So, why is Google's AI chatbot, Gemini, unable to provide some specific information? Before You Go is next. Before you go, if you've ever tried any of the AI tools out there, specifically generative AI tools, you're probably used to them producing information such as, text, images, audio, even web links within a blink of an eye in response to your query. But Google recently announced it is restricting its AI chatbot called Gemini from answering election-related questions. This is supposed to take effect in countries where elections are taking place this year. Remember, I told you last week that about 64 countries are holding elections this year. Well, the new policy has apparently already been rolled out in India and the United States, and I guess it will soon roll out in other parts of the world. You might be wondering why the restrictions? So, in February this year, Gemini came in for a lot of flack for generating images that inaccurately depicted people from history.
We've been telling you a lot about Google's Gemini. That's the AI chatbot that generated this picture when asked what Nazis look like. You can see, among others, there's a black man and an Asian woman wearing SS uniforms. There was no black Nazis or Asian women Nazis. Of course, it was the way of Gemini being woke.
Google CEO Sundar Pichai saying this week that the company's Gemini AI chatbot's inaccurate depictions of people were unacceptable. So are Gemini's mistakes a cause for wide concern?
So it appears Google's move is to prevent any further distortions or misrepresentations, saying that the move to restrict Gemini on election-related queries is, quote, out of an abundance of caution. If you were to ask Gemini about politicians, political parties, or voting in a place like India or the US where the policy is already in place, you're going to get a response that says something like this, quote, "I'm still learning how to answer this. In the meantime, try Google search," unquote. Well, OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, is also taking measures to avoid misinformation surrounding elections. They announced their plans earlier this year, and that includes banning people from using OpenAI's tools to create chatbots that impersonate real candidates or government, misrepresent how voting works, or discourage people from voting. And if you plan to use its image generator, DALL-E, guess what? There'll be a digital watermark on AI-generated images with information about its origin so it can be easily identified. If you ask me, listen, I'd say just visit the website of your national election organizer for any election-related information you need. Quick update for you on our discussion from our very first episode with Dr. Ramatoulaye Dieng. Senegal's government has announced the postponed elections will now be held on March 24. And if you did not hear that conversation with Dr. Ramatoulaye Dieng, you can always find it on our page. And you can also check our show notes for a link to the Brief Tenderlight website for the documentary's trailer and more information. Many thanks to Arthur Musah for joining us today. Thanks to my producer Gertrude Davison Tete and Bright Dra, our social media coordinator. I'm Nia Krofis Matabe. Enjoy your weekend and we'll speak soon.